Welcome to the Alzheimer's and Dementia Summit. I'm your host, Jonathan Landsman. Did you know that every 3 seconds, someone gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's or dementia? In fact, Alzheimer's is the 6th leading cause of death, kills more people than breast and prostate cancer combined, and Western medicine fails to offer a solution. As a health and fitness consultant for nearly 30 years, I believe Alzheimer's and dementia are the most misunderstood, cruelest, and costliest of all diseases. That's why I created this summit, to help you prevent, slow down, and reverse cognitive decline before it's too late. Our show today, Dementia Warning, Uncovering the Threat of Emotional Stress. Our guest, Niki Gratrix, is an award-winning, internationally renowned registered nutritionist and health writer specializing in stress and mind-body medicine. In 2005, she co-founded one of the largest mind-body clinics in integrative medicine in the UK with patients in 35 countries, where she worked as a director of nutrition until 2010. In 2015, Niki hosted the Abundant Energy Summit, the largest ever free online health summit on overcoming fatigue, interviewing 29 of the world's leading experts on optimizing energy with over 30,000 participants. Back in the 1990s, a little-known massive study revealed that the vast majority of us are affected by emotional issues on some level or another. And although initially this may seem hard to believe, these emotional issues, which occur early on in our lives, can have profound influence on our brain health right now and as we age. Fortunately, we now know how to identify these issues, which in the past may have gone unnoticed, and today we'll discover why this issue is so important for all of us, no matter what age we are. Please join me in welcoming Niki Gratrix to our program. Niki, welcome.
Jonathan, thank you so much for having me. It's great to take part in your amazing event.
This is just an incredibly important topic. And, I almost feel like we're a little bit of a disadvantage, Niki, because so little of this is talked about in public. But for me, it doesn't make it any less important. Let's talk about it right now. How important, Niki, is it to address the stress and emotional trauma in recovering from Alzheimer's disease or any other brain disorder for that matter?
Jonathan, I couldn't agree more. I think emotional trauma in childhood is probably the most underexposed risk factor for all the major chronic complex illnesses today, and definitely Alzheimer's. And, there's so much talk about stress. Everyone talks about stress being having too many phone calls, having too much to do, the diary being full. And a lot of people understand that stress is bad for them. I think that's out there. But I truly don't feel that people are aware at all yet about the impact of early life stress, early life chronic severe stress. And we should, to provide context so people understand how important this is, especially in Alzheimer's as well, we should just expand a little bit on that study that you mentioned in the introduction there. So there are huge studies that have been done by the CDC in Kaiser Permanente, looking over 17,500 adults as part of huge studies in the mid-1990s. And what they were surveying for is what they called adverse childhood events. And they classified those events as creating emotional trauma, things like parents separating or divorce, things like physical, sexual and emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect, domestic violence, mental illness in the family, substance abuse and incarceration by a related family member. So first of all, the statistics are stunning, and they really put into context how important it is and how much we need to address this, and not just look at things like diet and all the rest of it, which are hugely important but are just a partial truth and part of the picture. So for a start, some of the results they found, for example, is that first of all, 67% of all those adults that were surveyed said they had at least one ACE in childhood. I'll actually talk about how that was an underestimate, and even the researchers said that was an underestimate, and it's actually much more prevalent. But 67%, just to put that into context, if we think about how much exposure there's been recently about gluten sensitivity and how big that's been, well, that's only 20% approximately of the population have been suspected to be impacted by that, but 67% of people have had an adverse childhood event. So the sort of things we should look at, if you have, for example, many ACEs in childhood, you have a dramatic increased risk of developing 7 out of the top 10 causes of death. And just to provide context so that people are aware about how this important is for general health and to give some context for Alzheimer's specifically, if you have 4 or more ACEs, your relative risk in adulthood of developing, for example, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder is 2.5 times higher than those people who have no ACEs. Hepatitis risk is 2.5 times higher. Depression is 4.5 times higher. Cancer is 2.5 times higher. Diabetes is 1.6 times higher. Stroke is 2.6 times higher. Being suicidal is 12 times higher. And specifically, we'll talk about Alzheimer's. It's 400% increased risk, 4.22 times increased risk of developing Alzheimer's if you have 4 ACEs. So that was actually, that specific one about Alzheimer's actually came from a different study of 28,000 Californians that was part of the Behavioral Risk Assessment Surveillance System, which is a system of telephone interviews that's actually sponsored by the CDC as well. So 8 or more ACEs, you have triple the risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times increased risk of heart disease. People with 6 or more ACEs have a reduced lifespan of 20 years. So that just gives some context. And actually, if you look at that, Alzheimer's is actually one of the higher risk ones to have, or it's a higher risk that you'll develop that than some of the other illnesses. So it's particularly important for people to be aware of that. There's huge studies at looking at autoimmune onset as well, so 15,500 adults, and they found that ACEs in childhood also impact that too. So this is huge. It's extremely important. And by the way, just in terms of that where I mentioned about prevalence, the researchers themselves admitted that they actually missed out quite a few types of ACEs that they just, at the time that when they were doing their research and they started it in the mid-1990s, they were just looking at things that they could think of, and they were also looking at just ACEs that they had been researched already. But for example, they missed things like racism, physical trauma in childhood, even homophobia, witnessing violence, death of a caregiver, financial crisis. So there's some very clear ACEs that actually they didn't include. And also they've missed something else called covert trauma. And covert trauma are essentially what traumatizes one person doesn't necessarily traumatize another. So trauma is subjective. And what is trauma? Emotional trauma, it's really an event that occurs that at the time we weren't able to process. So it gets frozen into our minds and bodies and actually causes a lot of health problems. And some people are more sensitive than others. And some people actually have particular gene variants that make them a more sensitive type. And that's a very interesting area of research that people are looking into. These certain polymorphisms that make people, if you have the sensitivity gene, for example. And also, and this is absolutely a fascinating thing and absolutely confirmed, epigenetically they've absolutely proven that trauma is intergenerationally inherited. So third-generation survivors of the Holocaust victims showed the same physiological and psychological imbalances that their parents, the grandparents had at the time of things that they developed in response to the terrible trauma that they went through. And they found that they've confirmed it with other events that have happened, survivors whose grandparents were part of the Khmer Rouge, for example, or where there's been areas where there's been a lot of famine. The impact of the family members at the time that occurs, that is passed on to the following offspring and generations. And they've also absolutely confirmed that in mice experiments and rat experiments. So if you think about, that's just the bottom line is probably there isn't anyone alive today who hasn't been affected by ACEs, either their own childhood or what happened to their parents. This impacts everybody. Everybody's, if they're alive today on the planet, is going to be impacted. So that gives some context, I think, about how important it is.
Niki, I think this is incredibly important for the healthcare providers that are listening to this. I know what we're doing is we're sparking a change right now that there'll be more of a questioning of people as they come into the medical offices, checking these things out. To put this on the ground, when a person is asked a particular question like, did you come from parents that were alcoholics, or did you see a death when you were younger? All of these things. Can you explain a little bit more clearly? Is it basically 1 point for every time somebody says yes or they've experienced something? I mean, how does it work that you actually get a score of, say, a 4, a 5, or 6, or even, God forbid, higher than that on this ACE test? Maybe you should explain that for a moment or so.
Yes, so the original questionnaire that the researchers who were part of Kaiser Permanente and CDC, from the CDC, they created a list of 10 questions. They had 10 ACEs, and it related to a very straightforward question for each ACE, 1 mark for each question if it was yes, and it was basically did you experience this before the age of 18? And it would be literally, they went through that brief list that I mentioned. So did your parents separate or divorce? Have you experienced, and if yes, 1 point. Have you had physical abuse? If yes, 1 point. Have you been sexually abused? If yes, 1 point. Would you say that you had emotional abuse? If yes, 1 point. Obviously, the sentences were a little bit longer, but that was the 10. And so physical and emotional neglect was 1 point each. Domestic violence, 1 point. Mental illness in the family, 1 point. Substance abuse in the family, 1 point. Incarceration in a family member, 1 point. So their questionnaire was a total of 10, but I actually sort of use a questionnaire in my clinical practice, and I extended it to include additional questions for the ones that the researchers missed, like did you experience bullying? Were you a victim of racism or homophobia? And that as well. But officially there were 10 that were part of that huge study.
So why don't we talk about this a little bit more now, Niki? How exactly does stress or trauma affect and change our brain function? This is really important to understand.
Yes, so in effect, how does childhood biography become our biology in adulthood? And this is a key area. So one of the things that we know is that certainly these adverse childhood events, the way they impact children is that they absolutely will impact their behavior, which would lead to destructive health patterns. So, and that was confirmed, and actually that 28,000 person California one, for example, if you have had ACEs, you're certainly more likely to, for example, do binge drinking, eat bad food. For example, you're 7 times more likely to become an alcoholic if you had ACEs, 4 ACEs. And if you had 4 ACEs, you're 11 times more likely to use injection drugs. You were more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior. So that was a contributing factor. So the trauma leads to addictive and destructive behavior patterns because people are in pain and trying to distract themselves, and it also affects their brain function from a young age, so it leads on to behavior, and obviously those types of behaviors would be correlated with those health statistics. However, absolutely wasn't enough to explain the results. Because, for example, you could have the big original study showed you could have normal cholesterol, normal weight, didn't smoke, didn't drink, but if you had 7 ACEs, you still had a 360% increased risk of heart disease. So it clearly wasn't just behavioral patterns. And they found a similar large study confirming that with over 17,000 adults looking at lung cancer and smoking. And they found that smoking wasn't enough. The increased risk that you would smoke because you had ACEs wasn't enough to explain the increased risk of lung cancer. So there had to be something else going on. And essentially, so what was going on, really we get to start talking about the biology of stress. It's the psychoneuroimmunology, if you like, of mind-body medicine and how emotional trauma impacts us epigenetically and impacts brain function from a young age. So expanding on that, one of the things, as children, obviously our brains are still developing. The neurons are regenerating and growing all the time. And so things that happen to us in childhood have a greater impact and imprint on us and are more likely to impact and reset our system for life based on what happens to us at a very young age, because it's an imprinting stage. So what researchers have found, they found a couple of main areas where the direction of the research is going. One is that they've definitely found that If you have a low-level intermittent stressor that is unpredictable and that makes it toxic, or you can have a one-off chronic shock, it will literally do something called, it'll kindle the brain. It's called kindling. And what that means is that the brain is actually learning to react to that stressor. And if it's just a one-off shock or this low-level intermittent exposure causes the brain to become excessively sensitive to stress without even the stressor being there anymore. So in other words, it's actually conditioning the brain to require a lower threshold to respond to stress in the future. So you need less stress in the future to react to it. So the brain is actually resetting. And they also have confirmed that, and they found that epigenetically. And it's to do with glucocorticoid receptors, where they found that this chronic stress from childhood will actually make the threshold required for someone to have this stress response a lot lower, meaning you're less resilient for life. So you're conditioning it. And some of the basic kind of biology of stress that's pretty, it's fairly well understood. It's important to emphasize that you're resetting the brain, but there's this cascade impact that happens when you're stuck in a fight-flight response. So we know a lot of people understand a little bit from their basic biology about a fight-flight response and responding to a stressor, where there's a release of of cortisol, there's an increased sympathetic nervous system reactivity, and there's a cascading impact. And we know there's plenty of research out there that shows that if that's chronic and if it's long-term, it has all kinds of impacts on the body. It skews the immune system so that it's overreacting to some things like creating sensitivity, and then is not working hard enough in other areas, so we're more prone to get viral and bacterial infections. There's absolute research confirming that it will create gut dysbiosis. Early life stress has been replicated in young primates and monkeys, and it clearly shows your microbiome shifts if you have early life stress. That's setting you up for all the autoimmune disorders and all the kind of gut dysbiosis, inflammatory related disorders. It can affect mitochondrial function, a multitude of impacts. But I wanted to focus specifically on the impact on the brain, and specifically how that links and has ended up with the link to Alzheimer's. So, whether you end up with fibromyalgia or an autoimmune disease or heart disease, it's just where the weak link in the genetic chain is. But if you're prone to specifically developing Alzheimer's, it's really important to understand how the mechanism works. So chronic, unpredictable early life stress basically creates a lifetime of low-grade inflammation in the brain itself, and researchers didn't think that was possible. That they thought the brain was, quote-unquote, immune privileged, meaning that you could only get inflammation in the brain in response to an external trauma, like an accident. But it turns out the brain can become inflamed, and what happens is this early life trauma resets the tone of the brain for life, leading to chronic neuroinflammation. The inflammation is coming from non-neuronal cells called the microglia. And these microglia are essentially the brain's immune system, which we also didn't realize until fairly recently in the research that the brain actually has its own immune system. These microglia make up about 1/10 of the total number of cells in the brain. And what they're supposed to do is naturally prune, the dead neurons and the debris and essentially take the trash out. But in the face of chronic, unpredictable emotional stress, and this is quoting the researchers, they said the microglia go, quote-unquote, berserk. And they pump out neurochemicals and cytokines which lead to this neuroinflammation. And they basically start pruning neurons and eating away at the brain synapses that are needed for obviously normal brain function, executive function, memory and concentration. So the researchers are thinking this resets the tone of the brain. It can lead to other mental disorders, depression, anxiety, but it's also linked with these more serious psychopathologies like schizophrenia and Alzheimer's. And it's also been found that these microglia will actually eat up and prevent the very important neurons that are part of the hippocampus in part of the brain. And that's very important because in the hippocampus, there are special neurons that regenerate themselves. And if you've got these microglia going crazy preventing that, then the brain's not renewing and regenerating itself. So that is essentially the kind of 101 guide to how the mind and emotional stress is turning into the biology and leading to all these chronic complex imbalances.
Clearly, Nikki, one of the most destructive things, at least in my own personal experience being in the health and wellness field for nearly 30 years, is to have our emotions control our entire life. Emotions are very powerful. There's nothing wrong with them. But if without any awareness or thoughtfulness at all from where we've come from or how we're responding to things, and we're not engaging mentally, we're not thinking about things in a different way, we're not reframing things that we really need to reframe in our life, or else we could literally be destroyed by it, then we're seriously looking for some problems if we don't fix these things. In Eastern philosophy, traditional medicine, if you will, they talk about this all the time as well. This ties right into what they teach people for thousands of years. Worry, how worry affects the lungs. Fear, how it affects the kidney area. And anger issues, how that affects the liver. And we know how depression increases the risk for dementia. So, having said all of that, Nikki, you talk about 5 steps to addressing these emotional traumas and healing the brain, which is really important. Can you explain them?
Yes, will do. And the great news is, after all that negative information and kind of the statistics and so on, the great news is we can change our brains and we can grow new neurons and neuroplasticity. Thank goodness for neuroplasticity. You know, we can change the brain for the bad, or we can also change the brain for the good. And that's already been shown and researched. And we can also change how our genes epigenetically are expressing themselves. So that's the great news. In other words, it's absolutely reversible, and it's also the emotional trauma itself is absolutely something which can be resolved. And it's just if people will know what to do and to take this multifactorial approach that I'm going to cover now. So I suppose my 5-step approach, obviously with step 1, I call this step 1 for people who care about this is explore, because this is the first time you might have even heard about this, and you may not even have considered that something that happened to you in childhood could be impacting you now. So the first thing you can do, obviously what most people want to do, is go and get their ACE score and go and top their levels up. So I have a completely freely available questionnaire on my website, which is nikigratrix.com. ACE score, just go straight to that page, no opt-in required or anything, it's right there, and you can go and have a look right away and just start to have a look at what your score is. As a resource, just so that people know, there is one very good book called Childhood Disrupted by Donna Jackson Nakasawa. And that's a useful book because she explores a lot of patient stories. And really, when you're starting to think about ACEs and what happened to you in childhood and how that impacted you, you know, are you somebody who actually is kind of chronically angry all the time? Are you somebody who's kind of chronically sad all the time? Or are you somebody who's chronically anxious all the time? That's because some trauma from the past actually got stuck. And trauma, to release trauma, there's like a 4-step process that's well known that people tend to go through: the kind of shock, then they go through anger and denial, then they go through kind of depression stage, and then they go into reintegration and acceptance and recovery. But most people, they don't go through those steps of recovering from emotional trauma. They tend to disassociate. They're not in touch with that part of themselves, and other people will kind of notice that person's particularly triggered around certain things, but they won't know it, and so they're unaware of it. So, you know, it's exploring who you are and how you respond to the world, and how actually going back and looking at what happened. And one of the things that's research that shows that helps, and this is all low cost things that people can do, journaling. So you could start by going through this and actually writing about your childhood experience. How did they affect you? Are you a highly sensitive person? Was there anyone there at the time that you could talk to about when this stuff happened? Because that's a factor that actually helps people recover from it or not. How many ACEs? Was it just one big one, or was it sort of many things? So, and also, did it affect your personality? So one of the things that adverse childhood events do is they actually define our whole personality. They can do. So you can end up being, a chronic achiever type, for example, because maybe you were excessively criticized, abusively treated by a caregiver who made you think you were never good enough. So you responded to that in your entire life by, for example, being a perfectionist or being an achiever, or maybe you became an overgiver and you never give enough to yourself or spend enough time doing self-care. Or another type is an anxiety type. So, are you a chronic worrier about everything? So one of the things is, again, this is easy, low cost to do, but there's actually a very useful personality test that I used sort of clinically, and many of the psychologists who are aware about ACEs and so on use, and it's called the Enneagram personality test. And it's 9 different personality types, and it's just another tool that asks you a set of questions so that you start opening up and exploring and kind of looking at, wow, it's not only that I'm angry all the time, but also I have this personality drive that means I don't look after myself and my health, and that's actually my biggest issue, for example. So you can do the personality test for free at enneagraminstitute.com. So just go to the website ENNEAGRAM institute.com. There is a related book called The Wisdom of the Enneagram as well, which you can look up, that's written by the people who founded the Institute. So that's some simple things you can do at home. The other thing to do, which it can be very useful for some, just talking to somebody about, maybe you've never talked about what happened in childhood. Maybe you've just never openly spoken about it to somebody. Just speaking about it with somebody who's a trusted, non-judgmental, for example, counselor or psychotherapist. You don't have to do some fancy kind of therapy, just talking about it. And sometimes somebody mirroring back to you, what you've said can increase awareness. And awareness itself, which is great news, can heal emotional trauma, just the awareness. So I guess that would be kind of step 1, simple things to do that are also relatively low cost. The second thing, point number 2 in my plan of recovery here, definitely there are research-backed lifestyle interventions which are absolutely shown to reduce stress, reduce inflammation in the brain and in the body. And these are the 4 biggies are Qigong, yoga, Tai Chi, and meditation. Definitely you can just go into PubMed, look at the scientific studies, plenty of good research that those are definitely supportive, helpful at resetting the brain and reducing inflammation, all important. So, with that, I would explore which one, that you personally resonates with you the most, and definitely bring it in as a practice, make it part of your lifestyle and something you do, on a weekly, daily basis. And that's pretty well known for people. I think a lot of people understand those things help with stress. A lot of people don't understand point number 3 and aren't so aware about this, and it's actually a key area. But step number 3 is you do need to be really aware about your relationships and cultural impacts when you're recovering from emotional trauma. So there's 25 years of research by the HeartMath Institute has shown essentially that who you hang out with is who you become. And we all have an electromagnetic field around our heart, which is measurable with a magnetometer, scientifically validated. And this electromagnetic field around our hearts actually correlates with how we feel emotionally. So they can actually find a correlation. They've got 75% correlation by just looking at heart rate variability on a screen, and they can tell you how you're feeling by looking at the heart rate variability. So our fields as humans overlap. And essentially, other people will affect you seriously. And I talk about a bit of a provocative term, but I call them energy vampires. So you could be doing great work that essentially when you're resolving emotional trauma, when you start resolving anger, depression or things like this, you could call it your vibrational state is rising, your energetic state is rising, you're more of emotionally, if there's one word which describes proof that you're recovering from emotional trauma is the word joy. It's actually being high, joy, happy, resilient to what's happening in your life. And the one thing that will bring that down, and I've seen this so much with my own patients in clinical practice, you also have to be aware that when you're recovering, you might need to let some friends go. There might be certain people in even your family environment that you might need to limit exposure with because they're still in their place. They might not be ready to look into this. They might not be a health nut like you, but they will definitely be impacting you. I have to bring this up. It's kind of a point that not many people will realize, but I bring it up because I see it as a block so many times. People are doing brilliantly, recovering, feeling so much better, getting their energy back, health is recovering, and then they hit a wall, and it's quite often where they just need to be aware. You'll start to notice that as you heal from emotional trauma, you'll start to notice that some people, after you've spent time with them, your energy is through the floor. and you'll just feel really bad, and you'll know that something happened. And that's actually a real phenomenon, and it's a flag that I want to sort of raise to people. Who you hang out with is who you become, and social genomics has absolutely proven that too. Step number 4, definitely some people would want to consider deeper professional help, more advanced professional help. Some people, in my experience, have had a lot of trouble recovering from trauma and trying to just do things at home like meditation. They might be too anxious to do it, or they just can't sit there and be quiet, and as soon as they do it, just, their anxiety or their thoughts can go crazy. And that could be because if you think about it, we're saying that from childhood the brain has been reset to respond to stress more easily. You're literally hardwired. The brain's been hardwired for stress. That's very difficult at the beginning stages, just to do meditation on your own. For some people, it can be hard work. So this is where some very specific, there's plenty of therapies out there that specifically address emotional trauma that are shown scientifically to do good things for people. I've mentioned psychotherapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy also does help some people. I must say, before I say anything else on this, everyone is psychologically different, just the same way that everyone is biochemically different. What works for one person won't work for another. So you've got to find what resonates with you, the right practitioner who just nails it on the head right for you. But just because a friend might say they've done something and it worked for them and it doesn't work for you, don't give up, don't lose hope. It's just because you need to find the right therapy. So other forms of therapy to definitely look into: neuro-linguistic programming, NLP. Definitely practitioners of NLP have helped a lot of people overcome trauma. You'll see online a lot about EFT, that's emotional freedom technique. Also sort of related is thought field therapy, that's TFT. There's tons of free resources online. If you put emotional freedom technique online and Google, there are practitioners out there. There's free YouTube videos about how to tap to release discrete emotional trauma. That could be great. I've had people swear by that. Other people did hypnotherapy. They just found a great hypnotherapist and changed their life. Doesn't work for everybody, does for some. A very specific, I've mentioned a couple, 2 more or 3 more that are the big ones. There's something called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Definitely emdr.com, you can find a practitioner on that site. Is a form of, I would say it's actually energetic healing again, and it's to do with just thinking about the traumatic memory, and then you move your eyes from side to side, and amazingly it actually disrupts the pattern that's imprinted in the brain. Family constellations is something that Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt is a promoter of. That's for intergenerational, it's a group therapy for intergenerational trauma. So very specific thing. And the last one I must mention is Dr. Peter Levine, who wrote Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma, world-leading expert on trauma, his somatic experiencing. Very important, it's a body release trauma. Trauma doesn't exist just in the brain. It also gets into the energy body and into the physical body, and it gets stored there. So by somatic experiencing, we're actually re-experiencing and releasing what happened through the body. So that's the last one for sort of professional help. My final point 5 is really the message for everybody to take a multifactorial approach. So we don't just want to look at the psychology side. The mind and body, if there's anything we've learned from psychoneuroimmunology, is that it's absolutely one thing. And it may have started in emotional trauma, which started in the brain and then had those cascading impacts where the body changed. But we know, for example, that if somebody has gut dysbiosis and changes in their microbiome, that will cause anxiety. We know that if you have a lack of nutrients in your body, maybe from malabsorption, from gut dysbiosis and leaky gut, that can lead to anxiety. So anything sort of that, many other aspects I'm sure you're covering on the summit, Jonathan, things like dealing with gut issues, leaky gut, chemical sensitivities, food sensitivities, cleaning up the diet, an organic whole foods diet, and I'm sure people are going into specifics on that too. And also, I would definitely look into things where, adaptogenic support for the adrenal axis, for example. These things can all be very helpful and supportive. So just because something is, was an emotional trauma, I've gone through how to resolve that, but do address the body, because it's a vicious cycle, and we need to basically reduce the allostatic load on all levels. So reduce toxins. The body itself doesn't, the word stress, the body doesn't differentiate between toxic stress that's coming from chemicals and physical or emotional. It doesn't differentiate. So just unload the boat, because that will help everything and it'll help resolve the trauma as well. So there's my 5-point plan.
Niki, that was all so well said. And I just want to make something perfectly clear. As you're listening to this presentation, emotional and mental issues early on in life may be a huge factor for you. But in many cases, this may not resonate with you as much as some of the other presentations, which I encourage you to listen to, because having a poor diet, having too many toxins in your body that are impacting your digestive system, all of these things can also be playing a role in why your energy is so low, which then spills into why mentally and emotionally you are not operating on all cylinders. So it may not just be a mental emotional source, as Niki had just mentioned, but it may be one of these physical stresses that you have to take care of. So please make it a point to listen to as many of these presentations as you can, because as Niki said, and it's something I strongly support as an idea, listening to this information, something is going to resonate with you. And I mean, something's going to resonate really strong. And that's what I suggest that you do. Tackle that one issue, make sure you take action, and then look into other things at another time, but never feel overwhelmed by any of this information. Niki, you've given us a lot to think about. That is for sure. Someone who's new to this information, where do they start?
I would say just start out with doing step 1 and explore ACEs and explore your own sort of background and history. And I think this part of my final message here as well is it's learning to listen to your own body, your own thoughts, your own mind, and let that guide you ultimately. So we're just facilitating, we're providing, all of the information and bringing to attention, all the avenues that are out there. Those are all opportunities for resolution, recovery, healing. But the one that you choose is going to be the one that, this intuition does come into this and how people personally feel about something. And, when you're listening to other patients' stories, somebody might say something that you go, that's me. That person, the way they talked about what happened, what they did to recover, that totally resonates with me. That's how I felt. And that's generally how I've noticed that people find their path on this. And it tends, for something that's been going on for many years, it is, I hate to say it, I know people don't want to hear it, but there isn't a one-shot, short-term cure. It tends to be a lifestyle shift, and in many ways this is a call to transformation, a waking up of awareness to your physical body, your psychological body, your human psyche, and who you are in the world, and where you came from, and why you do the things that you do. So it's kind of a call to find your inner journey as well as this external journey. And I think that's also been, very underexposed about, people looking at their internal state. And this is why I'm here on this mission to kind of say, hey, guys, that's important, extremely important when it comes to health. So the body knows how to heal itself and, never give up. And one last point, we live in a world where we're used to being given prescriptions by doctors, like this externally kind of imposed thing. And I have people who say this to me, can you tell me how many of this I'm supposed to take, how many times a day, in what dosage, and that's an externally kind of paternalistic, hierarchical model, which is actually on its way out. And what we're trying to get people to do is learn to be a master of their own body and listen to their body, and you should know your body better than any external person, doctor, healer, whoever it is, because it's your body and you're going to care most about it. So we're trying to get away from this sort of external prescription and imposing that on you. So the idea is people listening to their body and then adapting to what their body's saying it needs that day, which could be different from next week, which could be different from someone else, and what works for them. So that's just this kind of final point that I'd like to make.
And Niki, just to get a little personal at the end, because I certainly don't mind to do this, and I don't mean getting personal with you, but getting personal with myself. I couldn't agree with you more than I do because of what you just said about learning what's going on with yourself and trusting in that, which in the Western model almost seems to be something that's irresponsible, right? A conventionally trained doctor would roll their eyes at something like what we're talking about, that somehow without any medical training, we're going to know something better for our health than somebody who has spent $500,000 in medical training in all these years and is a specialist. But I couldn't agree with you more, as I said before. And what I'm talking about in particular with me was certainly getting from a mentor that I had in my life, talking specifically about mental and emotional issues, who taught me the whole nature of what anger was all about. And when he was doing his teaching, sharing his wisdom with me, it just pierced right through me. And I understood with my own anger issues when I was younger what that was all about. And it just blew me away. My point in bringing this up was not that he necessarily did anything for me, but because he had such great insight and such wisdom and such a great ability to teach what anger really is, it really opened up my own mind and my own heart as to what anger was in my life. And then I proceeded to take a lot of action on my own to take care of those issues. And boy, do I feel so much better now. But it's right in line with what you were talking about before, Niki, about, doing what resonates best with you, listening to an expert like you or listening to some of the other presentations. And just to please remember that anyone listening to this, I feel you already know what needs to be done. Seek out those things and those people listening to events like this that you feel are going to support you, but these are decisions that you can make for yourself. And go ahead and just do it, and do it with confidence. That's what I think this is all about. Don't worry so much anymore. Just do it and take action.
Absolutely great advice. And explore and experiment, and don't be afraid that, something doesn't work for you. Great. You've just discovered, something else about yourself and your own healing journey. So, yeah, great advice.
Niki, I want to thank you so much for your time today. And I want to thank our listeners for joining us. If you would like a copy of this program plus all the other presentations inside the Alzheimer's and Dementia Summit, simply click the banner you see on this page. Thanks again for attending the Alzheimer's and Dementia Summit. Talk to you soon. Take care.